Hello, everyone. My name is Justin, aka Ghost Reader, and I'm here with Brian from Bookish.
Hello.
And today we are doing something a bit special. We're doing a kind of like a live short discussion of this great book that we read, and Brian is going to tell us a little bit about what that book is and introduce our reading group as well.
Okay, so the book that we read is Unspeakable, the story of Junius Wilson. It's by two authors, Sarah Burch and Hannah Joyner. Hannah Joyner is BookTube's own Hannah's Books, and she's one of the co-authors of this book. And Sean, the book maniac, put together a reading group, which he's called on Voxer the Unspeakable reading group. And it's Sean and Justin and myself and Roz from Scally Daniel about the books and Alba from Seriella. And so we got together and have been talking about the book really throughout November. We had Voxer conversations about the book and discussed it and had a really good time doing it and a really enjoyable read and discussion.
Right, and just a little bit about the book. The book is about Junius Wilson. He was a African American man that was deaf. He unfortunately was committed to a mental institution, very young. I think he was a teenager, correct?
Yes.
At the time, and he was not meant to be there for the crime that he was supposedly put there for. He did not commit. And so, because he was deaf, and there wasn't a lot of knowledge about how to deal with deaf individuals, he was committed to a mental institution and stayed there basically until he died. And this book chronicles his time at the institution, but not just his time at the institution, from what we know of records and some of what he was able to communicate, but also about the condition of how we dealt with deaf individuals in the United States. Also, how that was dealt with in terms of racism, as well, and how that impacted and him, and how he was basically the crossroads between how deaf people were treated not as well as they should have been, and also how African Americans were treated, kind of intersected to make kind of this tragedy for him, where he wasn't able to live life outside this institution because he was just kind of put there and just forgotten, unfortunately. So I thought it was a really good book at bringing to light a lot of information I didn't know about the history of the deaf community in the United States, and how the state has dealt with that. And I thought that was a really good part of the book, and also explaining his story too. It did a really good job of bringing that story. When you agree, Brian?
I do. I really thought the book did a great job of taking kind of a one man's life and making a much bigger, giving a much bigger picture of,
Right.
like you said, of racism and how racism played out in terms of institutionalizing people, how easy and unfortunately tragically easy it was to get somebody committed under those circumstances, and then just kind of the evolution of the mental health, well, industry, I guess, in terms
Right.
of how it dealt with institutionalized people. Because it just struck me is for so long you have a deaf young man and then all the way through an old man in one of these institutions, and nobody bothered to learn sign language
Right. Right.
almost the end of his life. And so, he was essentially just isolated in every way you can imagine. And I think part of the great thing about his story is that it's kind of one of those triumph of the human spirit things. In a way, he figured out a way to adapt, and for a while, until they kept changing the rules on him,
Right.
actually found a way to enjoy life and have meaning out of a horrible circumstance. But to me, it was a remarkable book because it gave all those bigger pictures like that.
Exactly. Brought up a really good point about the mental health. There's also a book about the mental health community as well, because and you made a really good point where no one took the time or effort to try to learn uh, about like sign language at all. Even though he learned, and this I thought was really interesting. Depending on what school you went to learn sign language as a deaf person, there were very unique signs for that particular school. So if you didn't go to that school, you could have a hard time signing with someone from a different school. And because he went to one for mostly African Americans, if you didn't have an African American who learns the sign language at that time from that school, it was really hard to communicate. So even when they did try to communicate with him, there was still some disconnect. So he
Right.
wasn't really able to, communicate well with a lot of people, or almost anyone, except for that one person they finally did bring in. And even he had a little trouble at times
Right.
communicating with him.
Absolutely.
But like you said, triumph of the human spirit. Even with all that going on, he was able to live somewhat of a happy life, even with all that
When
going
they
on.
left him alone to do
When
so.
they left
Yeah.
him alone, right? And then they're bringing in all these people, and he's just like, "What? Just let me, let me be me." Oh man! So one thing that we thought we would do was that we have a couple of questions for Hannah, who wrote this book. And once again, I just want to say you did a really good job with this book, and I'm glad I got the chance to read this because I'm in the middle of a reading slump. If you haven't noticed, I haven't been on BookTube in a while, but I did read this book, and I have to say that it was really good, and I really enjoy reading it and learning more. So, me and Brian have some questions for you, Hannah.
And I think the others are going to ask questions.
Oh yeah,
So.
right. And Brian's absolutely correct. There are going to be others as well, the other people in our group who are going to be asking questions as well in this video. So please stay tuned to those. All right. So my question is, did you have an interest in the history of how the deaf community was treated in the United States or the world at large before you started writing this book, or did it just kind of evolve out of like some type of other research you were doing at the time? Because I found it really interesting um for that this particular topic. Was there like something that sparked it in you and decided to say I need to like delve into this more? So that would be like my one of my question for you, Hannah.
Hello, everybody. I'm so thrilled that you all read this book, and I'm excited to get to talk to you today. Thank you so much for all your kind words. I love your question, Justin, about what sparked this book. My co author, Susan Burch, was the one who first started thinking about Junius Wilson as a subject to learn about and write about. But actually, I was familiar with the story from quite a bit earlier. When I was in grad school in history, getting a master's degree from the University of North Carolina right around 1990, Mr. Wilson's situation was just starting to be discussed in the newspapers in North Carolina when John Lawson and others brought the story forward publicly. Because I was already interested in the intersection of racism and institutionalization in the post-Civil War South, the account of what had happened to Wilson was one I followed closely as it developed over the next couple of years. Things then took sort of an unexpected turn for me. I moved to an academic program in Philadelphia, and as I was preparing to take comprehensive exams and then start writing my dissertation on the Reconstruction period immediately after the Civil War and how gender was also reconstructed, so to speak, during the period, I was diagnosed with a very large but non-cancerous tumor wrapped around my auditory nerve, and I had emergency brain surgery that lasted almost 24 hours. One of the results of that surgery was that I basically couldn't read at all for a year, and also I lost my hearing in one ear. It's a more complicated story, actually, but the basic point is that I began to learn sign language, partly because I feared I would soon lose hearing in the other ear, and a few other reasons. At the time, I was studying a lot about social construction of identity around the axes of race and class and gender, and I suddenly realized that disability and deafness fit into a very similar kind of model. So, in the midst of that bit of chaos in my life, I eventually changed my dissertation topic. And as soon as I was able, started researching disability and deafness in the U.S. South. At the same time, I was struggling to imagine being a professor in a classroom full of hearing students when I was having so much trouble even hearing a handful of friends in a small seminar. At the time, understanding what was happening in a group situation was especially hard for me because my brain was just starting to rewire itself a bit. Anyway, wildly, a professorship came open at Gallaudet University, a college in the U.S. for deaf students, and I applied and got the job. After I arrived on campus, I soon made friends with a new colleague, Susan Burch. While doing academic research for one of her own projects, Susan was looking for information on Black deaf experiences in the U.S., and she ran across some clippings about Junius Wilson while she was going through various files in the Gallaudet archives. Susan's main historical interest at that point was about deafness more broadly, But as she realized that there was a fairly significant amount of source material apparently available about Mr. Wilson, she realized that he was from North Carolina, my home state, and she turned to me and asked if I might be interested in writing a short article together. She thought that my interest in Southern history might be useful. I'll talk a bit more later about working collaboratively with Susan, but I'll say for now that the proposed little article developed into something much larger and much more meaningful to both of us than I think we could have imagined back then.
Brian?
Okay, and my question has to do kind of with just the nuts and bolts of writing a work of history like this. You know, I've done some historical research and writing, and so I was interested in the individual whose last name was McNeil, and unfortunately they called him Dummy McNeil
Right.
in the community where he lived, which is heartbreaking. But my question was, you know, did you find Mr. McNeil in your research once you started doing research about Junius Wilson, or did you already know about him? And then was that for you like a big moment in researching and writing the book, that you had this other person in a similar circumstance to Junius Wilson that you could then, you know, show the compare and contrast with?
Right. That's a good question because and for those you don't know, McNeil was another not blind, deaf man who was at the institution as at the same time as Junius was. And
Right.
so he had some of the similar challenges as Junius as well at that mental institution.
Yeah.
Learning about James McNeil, also known as Demi Graham, was definitely a big moment for us. We'd seen some references to McNeil early in our research, from General Hospital records, I think, but we really didn't know who he was. Although we had already listed his name in the database we were building, it took quite a bit more time before we learned any details about him and his experiences at Cherry Hospital. Part of the problem was that at first we were both assuming that every mention of a person called Dummy, a derogatory nickname for a deaf person, must be a reference to Junius Wilson. We had no idea there were other deaf residents at the institution. But we kept hearing stories that just didn't quite fit. For example, why would Wilson regularly be dressing as a policeman and directing traffic on the main campus at a time when Wilson lived and worked at the farm colony across the way? Eventually, one of the people Susan was interviewing pulled out a picture of Dummy McNeil in a police uniform, and it became clear to her that it was not a picture of Junius Wilson. We realized that there was more than one deaf man incarcerated at Cherry. Eventually, we learned of a third deaf man as well, although we could only gain very limited information about him. What was so heartbreaking to us is that the hospital kept Wilson and McNeil apart from each other for a great number of years. These two men had been classmates at the same residential school for deaf African Americans. They would have used the same language, but were apparently deliberately kept in separate areas of the institution for decades so they wouldn't be able to communicate with each other. In addition to the fact that learning a little bit about the existence of these two other men helped us understand that Wilson's experiences were not as exceptional as we first assumed, McNeil's story in particular helped us piece together a fuller picture of life at the institution. While Wilson was working on the farm colony, McNeil had lived on the other side of Cherry Hospital in a very different kind of system, living with outside privileges, but at the same time living in the ward specifically for the criminally insane. And yet, his way of creating a life for himself was not all that different from Mr. Wilson's way, by creating a certain kind of independence and even authority despite incarceration.
Another one question that I had was, what was surprised you the most about this book when you were researching it? Actually, not what surprised you about the book, but what most surprised you in your research for this book? Because there were some surprises in there for me, for sure. I didn't expect sterilization to pop up in this book. And it's something that does play a big role because Julius unfortunately was sterilized because he was considered a criminal element. And at that time in the United States, that was something that was kind of popular in the medical community, or had gained traction at least, that we should do this to, keep them from reading or whatever. So,
And
and
and went on well into the late 20th century.
Right. Exactly. And so, and I think she even brought out her book that there's something that is still kind of hidden and not really dealt with. And a lot of like, even though there's some people who have been pushing, we need to learn more about these people, who they were. There are some people, I think in North Carolina, they're saying, oh no, they're patient records. We can't release that to you.
Right.
So you can't look at that. But I think it may be more than that. Maybe like we don't want to deal with this type of a situation. But yeah, that was something that really surprised me. Not that they know what's going on, but that also was another layer of tragedy that was added on in this book. So
Definitely learning that Dummy Graham was not Junius Wilson, that he was in fact a different person with a somewhat similar situation, was a bit startling. And yes, you're definitely right that we weren't really expecting the intense talk about sterilization and eugenics. My memory is that while we were poring over Mr. Wilson's medical records, I sat there staring at a brief mention of his castration and was totally stunned, asking my husband with his medical knowledge to confirm that the words I was looking at really did mean what I thought they meant. I think Wilson's castration was one of the parts of the story that just wasn't talked about in the newspapers when the case broke, and it really wasn't mentioned much later in his life, as far as we could tell. Another surprise, or at least a completely devastating thing that we did not initially imagine, is that Junius Wilson did not understand why he was incarcerated. He apparently didn't know that he had been accused of sexual assault. Late in his life, after signers were finally brought in to communicate with him, he suggested that he had been arrested because way back when he was young at the School for the Deaf, he'd stayed out all night at the traveling fair, looking at elephants and fireworks and getting a taste of not only excitement but freedom. That's why he thought he was being punished for all those years.
yeah, so I think that's going to be all the questions between us two. There would
Yeah.
definitely be some other questions from the other people in the group who have some great questions. I got a chance to look at some of their questions. Do you have any like final thoughts you want to give for this book at all, Brian? Or
I just wanted to say again, I really enjoyed the book. I thought it was great. I thought Hannah and her co-author did a great job of kind of creating that kind of small history that has, big history impact. And I enjoyed being able to talk with all of you guys in the Voxer group about the book while we were reading it.
same, I thought that both authors did a great job putting this together. And just like you, just bringing all that history together, this one individual represents so many different parts of United States history and of things that we dealt with and challenges that we had to overcome. So just like you, and also enjoyed the Voxer group as well, even though like, there was a while there where I was kind of quiet. I enjoy like listening to all of the thoughts that you guys had and the points that you guys brought up in the Voxer group as well. So yeah, that's gonna be it for us. I'm gonna pass it on to Sean, and he's probably gonna do something with this edit to make this look really cool. So that's gonna be it for us. So thank you, and of course also thanks from Brian as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, and your co-author Susan Burch, of course, for writing this tremendous book, which was a pleasure to read, but also a privilege. I'm really excited to be able to ask you some questions. One of the strengths of the book for me is that you take one individual's life that kind of spans the 20th century and was quite a life of exceptional circumstances. And through that, you cover some of the key issues and topics of the 20th century in America and beyond. So my question is, did you know that all along? When you were planning to research and write Junius Wilson's story, did you think it was just going to be his story, or did you always know that it was going to bring up and illuminate so many other vital topics?
That's an interesting question, Roz, and I think the answer is both yes and no. When Susan and I started our research, we knew that the story of Junius Wilson's trial and early incarceration would allow us to discuss how the horrific racial system of Jim Crow, including the court system and the medical world, played out in Wilson's life. At least in my memory, we didn't really know at first how much we'd be able to find out about Mr. Wilson's experiences between the initial incarceration early in the 20th century and the trial near the end of the century. Fundamentally, though, as historians, our primary goal is always to think about change over time, to understand why change happens and what those changes mean for the way people experience their lives. And I grew up with another big historical idea, one my father called asking large questions in small places. Dad was partly interested in exploring how big social as well as political and economic transformations played out in particular communities. Maybe because of my connection to literature. Very early in grad school, I became interested in thinking about how those big historical transformations might play out even in a particular person's life. Interestingly, when you're asking large questions in small places, you aren't necessarily looking for a community or individual who is typical or representative. Sometimes an atypical case can really show the dimensions of how the larger society or system works, or how it can work when faced with extreme situations. Still, while I say that about atypical cases, at the same time, Junius Wilson wasn't nearly as exceptional as we thought. As we explored the records at his institution, we found at least those 2 other deaf men roughly his age I mentioned earlier, and there's evidence that the reasons for their incarceration may have been just as inappropriate as Mr. Wilson's. Deaf people across the country, especially deaf people who are also Black and poor, or people with mental health issues, are at risk. It was true early in the 20th century, and sadly, it's still true early in the 21st century.
Coming to this book as a white reader, I wondered how it was for you researching and writing Junius Wilson's story as a white historian and a white writer. Yeah. Maybe it didn't make any difference. Maybe it had no resonance, but I wondered, and I'd be interested to know.
Yeah, I think it was really important to recognize and acknowledge how our own identities affected our work and perceptions of our work by others as we were researching and writing this book. At the beginning, I think we were initially a little less concerned about issues of our identity as far as publication itself went, because we knew we were writing an academic book that would be read primarily by a small academic audience and not for a more commercial press. We never claim that we are immune from racial biases, despite our efforts to try to understand how our own experiences as white women shape how we see the world. And also, we weren't claiming that this book would be in any way the last word said on Junius Wilson. Interviewing people who were aging seemed quite important, and it needed to be done quickly, since many of the people who were close to Mr. Wilson were not necessarily going to be able to talk to investigators for that much longer. For future writers about Mr. Wilson, those interviews might be important. And really, interviewing people was where I think the question of our racial identities mattered most. As I'll talk about a little later, those interviews were almost exclusively Susan's work. She was very open and honest with Wilson's loved ones, and with the Cherry Hospital staff, and with legal guardians, etc., as well, about where she stood as an academic historian. Not everyone wanted to talk to us, not all hospital folks, but also not all family members, some of whom might have been questioning our motives, and we can both understand that. When Susan was talking with the family members who were closest to Mr. Wilson at the end of his life, and to his Black deaf friend Everett Parker, Susan was quite upfront that she wanted to learn about their stories and experiences, partly because she couldn't even imagine what their lives had been like. And she wanted to learn from them with both honesty and respect. They all wanted Mr. Wilson to be treated with dignity, and we wanted that too, and tried to live up to the trust they placed in us. I do want to mention one other related thing. We're not only both white women, but both hearing people, and that might be just as problematic for some deaf activists. We were not trying to speak for Black people in this book, and we were absolutely not trying to, quote, give voice to deaf people, an awful phrase, especially in this context. Fundamentally, this book is not only about Junius Wilson's life, but also about the whole system of racial injustice and the history of institutionalization across the 20th century, and that is a story which includes people of many different identities. Susan sometimes points out that a certain kind of authority was granted to her as a white signing woman across the diversity of the interviews she did. Sometimes that authority was just the unearned kind, the automatically privileged status of being white and hearing and educated. But I think it went beyond that sometimes, too. She was an outsider in some ways and an insider in others, a non-Southern white woman who signs fluently. Her ability to sign well created a sense of trust for some people, maybe even for some people who don't sign themselves, perhaps partly because it helped explain her interest in the story. Being a white signer made people less sure that she must have some particular axe to grind. It wasn't clear that she would be on one side or the other. And of course, we weren't on one side or the other. Our goal for the book was to try to understand some of what happened to Junius Wilson, to understand why people made the decisions they made over time, and to investigate how his particular story can help us understand the 20th century more broadly. I know this isn't a perfect answer, and I know Susan could talk more fluently about this issue than I have. Perhaps I'll try to talk her into having a bit of a chat with me here on BookTube sometime in the future. In fact, she has a new book coming out very soon that we could celebrate.
In Unspeakable, you and Susan Burch do an amazing job of piecing together Junius Wilson's life from a multitude of little sources, official records, so many bits, and interviews with individuals who knew him or worked or were inmates of the institution where he spent so much of his life. I wondered what were the sort of challenges really in writing this book, and whether there were any sources or perhaps particular individuals that you would have really liked to be able to reach and include and perhaps weren't able to.
There is so much we wish we could have been able to learn, for sure. There are some people who didn't want to talk to us, and a few who talked only if we promised not to quote them or refer to them by name. We definitely were hoping to learn more about James McNeil, and for a while we thought we might be able to gain access to his legal and medical files, but apparently they have all been destroyed at this point. And of course the biggest, we would have loved to have had the chance to meet Mr. Wilson himself. By the time we started working on this project, Wilson's ability to communicate had been severely limited not only by the many years of very limited forms of communication he could engage in with staff and other residents, etc., but also by the stroke that affected his main signing hand fairly significantly, and which may have affected his language processing as well. Despite those barriers, right as we were getting started, Susan arranged to travel to North Carolina to have a brief meeting with Wilson. The meeting was postponed when Wilson became ill, and then delayed again when he was hospitalized. Mr. Wilson died soon afterwards, before we got a chance to talk to him face to face. Susan's first trip to the campus of the institution, I think, was to attend Wilson's funeral.
Hola, Hannah, ¿cómo estás? I hope you're doing well as your family. I'm awestruck by Unspeakable, from reading this heart-wrenching story and also realizing the work that you and Susan Burch did to get this story to us. Such an accomplishment. I am so grateful for it. It was one of the two highlights of a very blah nonfiction November this year. As we read in the book, a family member filed a lawsuit, a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, which was dismissed. Okay, and then the new guardian for Junius Wilson filed a second lawsuit and was awarded a settlement. My question is, what happened to Junius Wilson's estate upon his passing?
Thank you so much, Alba. The court case that actually went through in the end only provided care for Wilson during his life and for his funeral. The house that was renovated for him to live in is still on the Cherry Hospital grounds and can be used for other purposes. Even his personal items, his clothes, or the puzzles he had been given as gifts were apparently redistributed to other residents. The Sidwells, the family members who were closest to Mr. Wilson late in his life, weren't even given one of his baseball caps. One item of Wilson's estate that has not stayed at Cherry Hospital is his last bicycle. He bought maybe 3 different bikes during his years at the institution with the money he had earned selling worms and snacks, etc. When Susan learned that the institution still had his last bicycle, she arranged for Cherry to donate the bike to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., where it's been on display a few times.
Again, I want to thank you, Hannah, for a very valuable addition to history. Te quiero mucho. Adios.
Hello, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. This was a great buddy read and a fabulous book. So, Hannah, good job. You and Susan did a fantastic job. I got so much out of this book. You wove the social history and even to a certain degree the political history into this very personal story that was a tragedy about Junius Wilson. And you did that seamlessly. That's hard to do because I have read quite a few books that didn't succeed. So bravo. My question is about the collaboration itself. Why did you collaborate? What was it like to collaborate? How did that work? Were you in the same city and were you in the same room writing, or did you use social media software like Skype or something? How did it work? And in what way did the collaborative process shape the book uniquely, that if either of you had written it separately or written a version of it separately, it would have been a very different book? Anything to do with that, I'm very interested to hear about.
Neither of us had really done any serious collaborative academic writing before this project. In general, historians work alone on their books. Sometimes a set of authors will put together a collection of essays, each by different writers, with each essay in the book written from a different voice. But working together to produce one full historical monograph with a unified argument and a single narrative voice, even though there were 2 of us, was something we had never experienced. Unspeakable was deeply collaborative, down to the level of each paragraph and sentence, but there were definitely places where our different strengths and skills came out. First, as I've mentioned here on BookTube before, I am very introverted and really think through reading and writing rather than through listening and speaking off the cuff. Susan, on the other hand, is much more extroverted, so Susan did all of the interviews with both deaf and hearing people. Susan is a far better signer than I am as well, so it worked out perfectly. Because my skills are more about being a reader and writer, I started by looking at written documents, from newspaper articles to court and medical records to the transcripts of the interviews Susan had done, and tried to piece together storylines for chapter drafts. That worked especially well for the early chapters, since my major field of history was race and gender in the 19th and early 20th century U.S. South. It seemed pretty natural for me to start there, thinking about what other historians had discovered about those periods and how Wilson's experiences illuminated or challenged their arguments. There's another fairly significant difference in our approaches or skills as historians. Susan is really fantastic at building an argument around a thesis, or making it clear how what she is saying is new and important. On the other hand, I tend to lean more toward creating a narrative arc, using the sources we have to make the setting clear, to show character development, etc. I don't mean I'm writing something less than fully evidence-based. I just mean that my primary strength and interest is in presenting a story, even if it means sublimating or disguising the thesis or argument more than I probably should. What I think we both realized was that one of the great strengths of working together on this project was that both the thesis and the narrative are essential in this kind of social history, and we very quickly and naturally found a way to bring out both, I think. You asked for more concrete details here, too, about our collaboration. When we started working together on this project, we lived relatively near each other. I had a young child and no car, but Susan often came by our house, or occasionally we met at a nearby cafe, one that had a children's section, to work for a few hours. While Abe would play around us, Susan and I would chat about where we were in our work or what we'd found out. Then, quite often, Susan would spend an hour or more playing with Abe while I did some typing and thinking. As crazy as it was, the babysitting that Susan provided at those particular moments was really important, I think. I got to do a little bit of thinking and framing immediately after we talked, and then got to talk with her again immediately afterwards. So yes, we did some work face-to-face, but we also sent research notes and questions as well as chapter drafts back and forth regularly. When we started, there really weren't big social networks and the like yet, believe it or not. I worked on an old PC, and she worked on a newer Mac, and we even had to plan a bit to send attachments to each other, attachments that our different computers could decode. Things have definitely gotten easier since then. When I said I did a lot of the drafts of chapters, especially the early chapters, I want to make it clear that there is pretty much not a sentence that doesn't have both our fingerprints all over it. Every once in a while, we think we might remember when one or the other of us suggested a particular phrase. But in general, I don't think we could tease apart who did any of the actual wording when it comes to the final text. Collaborating on this project was really important for another reason, too, because this was an especially difficult story emotionally. I think we needed someone else who understood what was happening, really horrific and heartbreaking stuff. We needed someone to be in it with us. Collaboration kept both the research and the writing process from becoming too isolating.
Thanks again. I loved the book.
I really want to thank all of you for reading this book, saying such wonderful things and asking great questions and engaging in the life of Junius Wilson. His story definitely helped me grow as a human being. I've talked a lot here on BookTube recently about how much I've been moved by the author George Eliot and her insistence on a kind of patience and compassion. I think my feeling of deep connection with that practice very much stems from researching and writing this book, Unspeakable. Susan and I made a decision very early on that we were going to try to understand why people made the decisions they made when they did, including the decisions that seemed to us to be horrific. We committed to assuming that they did those things not because they were evil people. It would be easy to place the blame for all the injustices Wilson experienced on racist judges or cartoon evil hospital administrators, or even cruel family members. But in reality, the issues Wilson presented to the participants in his story, from family members at the beginning of the 20th century to social activists at its end, required them all to engage in a lot of intricate moral thinking. And really, this is a story with a lot of heroes, people who tried to do the right thing for Wilson and for their families and communities, even when we now look back on their efforts and know they made missteps. They all faced major limitations on their behavior, limitations really shaped by their times. Racism and disability discrimination, the power of institutions and institutionalization, as well as the effects of poverty, really chiseled into the options of people who wanted to act justly. The truth of human motivations is far more complex than simple good and evil, and we know that from great literature, but also, of course, from history. Finally, I just want to say that I'm really honored that you read our book, and I know Susan is as well. At least for me, working on this book with Susan has been one of the things in my life which gives me the deepest sense of meaning and pride. Thank you again.